Detroit, Michigan, November 12, 1999. The Fox Theater was packed with 5,200 fans waiting for Whitney Houston to take the stage on her My Love Is Your Love tour. Outside the venue, the cold November wind cut through the streets as people hurried to find their seats. But 12 miles away, on the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit to Canada, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell stood on the pedestrian walkway, her hands gripping the cold metal railing as she looked down at the dark waters of the Detroit River below. Sarah had come here with one purpose: to end the pain that had become unbearable. She was 4 months pregnant, thrown out by her deeply religious parents, abandoned by her boyfriend, and living in a shelter with nowhere to turn. The weight of her situation felt heavier than she could carry. But Sarah wasn't alone on that bridge. Her best friend, Marcus Chun, had followed her. Marcus was 17, the only person who knew Sarah's secret, and he had spent the last hour trying to convince her to step away from that railing. Nothing was working. Sarah's mind was made up. The shame, the fear, the overwhelming sense of having ruined her life at 16, it all pointed to one solution. Marcus was desperate. He had tried everything he could think of, every argument, every promise, every plea. Then he remembered something: Sarah's obsession with Whitney Houston. Since they were kids, Sarah had played Whitney's music constantly. It was the one thing that seemed to reach her when nothing else could. Marcus pulled out his portable radio, one of those bulky devices that seemed ancient even in 1999, and turned it on. He scrolled through the static until he found WDTW, Detroit's R&B station. And then he heard it, the announcer's voice cutting through the cold night air. "Coming to you live from the Fox Theater, it's Whitney Houston performing I Believe in You and Me." Marcus turned up the volume as loud as it would go and held the radio between himself and Sarah. For the first time in an hour, Sarah turned away from the railing. Whitney's voice poured out of that small radio speaker, and despite the tinny quality, despite the wind and the traffic noise, the power of her vocals cut through everything. Sarah's hands loosened slightly on the railing. Marcus saw his opening. He started talking, not about Sarah's problems, but about Whitney. "Remember when we were 11 and we saved up for 3 months to buy the Bodyguard soundtrack? Remember how we played it so many times your mom threatened to throw the cassette out the window?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was listening. She was hearing Whitney sing about believing in someone, about seeing their true potential, about love that doesn't give up. And something inside Sarah, something that had been drowning under the weight of her despair, began to fight back. What Sarah and Marcus didn't know was that something extraordinary was happening 12 miles away at the Fox Theater. Something that would save Sarah's life in ways they couldn't imagine. Whitney Houston was struggling that night. Behind the glamorous facade, the flawless makeup, and the designer gown, Whitney was fighting her own demons. 1999 was a year of intense personal turmoil for her. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was becoming increasingly volatile. Her substance abuse, which she had managed to hide from the public, was spiraling. And the pressure to maintain her image as America's sweetheart while her personal life crumbled was crushing her. Frank Gatson, Whitney's choreographer and close friend, watched from the wings as Whitney prepared for I Believe in You and Me. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly before she walked on stage. Whitney had confided in him earlier that day. She was thinking about canceling the rest of the tour. She was thinking about checking into rehab. She was thinking about giving up. But the show must go on. That's what Whitney had been taught since childhood. No matter what you're feeling, no matter how much pain you're in, you perform. You give the audience what they came for. So Whitney walked onto that stage, microphone in hand, and began to sing. The first verse of I Believe in You and Me came out perfectly. Whitney's technical skill was so ingrained that even in her darkest moments, she could deliver a flawless performance. But as she reached the chorus, something shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the emotional weight she'd been carrying. Maybe it was something deeper, something spiritual. But Whitney suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to change the performance. Instead of following the choreographed staging, Whitney walked to the very edge of the stage and sat down, her legs dangling over the orchestra pit. The band, confused but professional, continued playing. The audience, sensing something unusual, grew quiet. Whitney closed her eyes and began singing differently. Not the polished, radio-ready version. This was raw, vulnerable, stripped of all pretense. Her voice cracked on certain notes, not from lack of skill, but from emotion. She was singing like someone who desperately needed to believe the words she was saying, like someone who was trying to convince herself that she was worth believing in. In the audience, people began to cry. This wasn't the Whitney Houston they expected, the untouchable superstar with a perfect voice. This was a woman sharing her pain, her doubt, her struggle. It was uncomfortable. It was beautiful. It was real. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, who was in the lighting booth, later described what he witnessed. I'd worked with Whitney for 15 years, and I'd never heard her sing like that. It was like she was having a conversation with God, working something out in real time. Every musician in that room knew we were witnessing something sacred. As Whitney reached the bridge of the song, she did something completely unscripted. She stopped singing the lyrics and began speaking over the music. Her words were broadcast throughout the theater, and because this was being simulcast on Detroit radio, her words were also being carried 12 miles away to a bridge where a pregnant 16-year-old girl was deciding whether to live or die. You know what? Whitney's voice echoed through the Fox Theater and out over the airwaves. Sometimes we don't believe in ourselves. Sometimes we look in the mirror and we hate what we see. Sometimes the mistakes we've made feel so big that we think there's no way back. Sometimes the pain is so heavy we just want to put it down, even if that means putting everything down. Sarah Mitchell, standing on the Ambassador Bridge with Marcus holding the radio, froze. It was as if Whitney was speaking directly to her. Marcus noticed Sarah's posture changing. She was no longer leaning toward the water. She was leaning toward the radio. Whitney continued, her voice breaking with emotion. But I'm here to tell you that you are worth believing in. Not tomorrow, not when you get your life together, not when you fix all your mistakes. Right now, exactly as you are, with all your mess, with all your pain, with all the things you think make you unlovable. You are worthy of love right now. The audience in the Fox Theater erupted in applause, but Whitney held up her hand. She wasn't finished. I don't know who needs to hear this tonight, Whitney said, tears visible on her cheeks under the stage lights. Maybe it's someone in this room. Maybe it's someone listening on the radio. Maybe it's me. But whoever you are, whatever you're going through, please don't give up. Please believe that your life has value. Please believe that the world needs you in it, even if you can't see why right now. On the Ambassador Bridge, Sarah Mitchell's hands released the railing. She stepped back from the edge and collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing. The radio fell to the ground, Whitney's voice continuing to pour out as she resumed singing I Believe in You and Me with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Fox Theater. Marcus held Sarah as she cried, not the desperate tears of someone who wanted to die, but the releasing tears of someone who had just decided to live. They sat on that cold bridge for another 20 minutes, listening as Whitney finished her set. When the concert ended, Marcus helped Sarah to her feet. Let's get you somewhere warm, he said. Sarah nodded, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach where her unborn child was growing. I need to thank her, Sarah whispered. Someday, I need to thank Whitney Houston for saving my life. What happened in the days and weeks following that November night would prove that Sarah Mitchell's decision to live was only the beginning of her story. Marcus took Sarah to his family's home that night. The Chun family, despite their modest means, welcomed Sarah without judgment. Marcus's mother, Helen, was a nurse at Detroit Receiving Hospital, and she immediately took charge of Sarah's care. Helen helped Sarah get connected with social services, enrolled her in a program for pregnant teens, and most importantly, gave her a safe place to stay. Sarah was terrified. At 16, she had no idea how she was going to raise a child. The shame of her situation was still overwhelming. But every time doubt crept in, every time she felt like giving up, she would play that recording. Marcus had captured Whitney's impromptu speech on his radio's recording feature, and Sarah listened to it every single day. You are worthy of love right now. With all your mess, with all your pain, with all the things you think make you unlovable. Those words became Sarah's lifeline. Sarah gave birth to a daughter on March 15, 2000. She named her Grace Whitney Mitchell. Grace because that's what Sarah felt she had been given on that bridge. Whitney because of the woman whose voice had pulled her back from the edge. Being a teenage mother was harder than Sarah could have imagined. She finished high school through a GED program while working part-time at a grocery store. She lived with the Chun family for 2 years, saving every penny she could. She faced judgment from people in her community who saw her as a cautionary tale. But Sarah had something many of them didn't. She had purpose. Every time she looked at her daughter Grace, she remembered that she had chosen life. And she was determined to make that choice count. When Grace was 2 years old, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. She was going to become a doctor. Not just any doctor, but an OB/GYN who specialized in high-risk pregnancies and teen mothers. People told her it was impossible. She was a single mother with a GED, working minimum wage. Medical school was for people with advantages, not for people like her. But Sarah was relentless. She enrolled in community college, taking classes at night while working during the day. She studied while Grace napped, did homework while other young mothers were out socializing, and never lost sight of her goal. It took her 6 years to finish her undergraduate degree. She applied to medical school and was rejected 3 times. On her 4th application, she included something different. She wrote about November 12, 1999. She wrote about standing on the Ambassador Bridge. She wrote about Whitney Houston's voice coming through a radio and giving her a reason to live. She wrote about her daughter Grace, who wouldn't exist if Sarah had made a different choice that night. The admissions committee at Wayne State University School of Medicine was moved by her story. They accepted her for the fall 2008 semester. Sarah Mitchell was going to become a doctor. Medical school was brutal. Sarah was older than most of her classmates, a single mother trying to balance studying with raising a now 8-year-old daughter. There were nights she only slept 3 hours. There were times she survived on ramen noodles and coffee. But she never quit. Grace was Sarah's constant reminder of why she was doing this. Sarah's daughter grew up understanding that her mother was fighting for something important. Grace would sit quietly doing her homework while Sarah studied anatomy. She would quiz her mother on medical terminology. She would tell her classmates with pride, "My mom is going to be a doctor." In 2012, Sarah was in her final year of medical residency at Detroit Receiving Hospital. She was exhausted, but triumphant. She had made it. Against all odds, she had achieved her dream. She was going to spend her career helping young women like herself, women who made mistakes, women who got pregnant too young, women who needed someone to believe in them. Then, on February 11th, 2012, Sarah was in the hospital break room when she saw the news on television. Whitney Houston had been found dead in her hotel room at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles. She was 48 years old. Sarah felt like the ground had opened beneath her. The woman who had saved her life was gone. Sarah requested time off from her residency to attend Whitney's funeral. Her supervisors, moved by her story, approved immediately. On February 18th, 2012, Sarah Mitchell and her 12-year-old daughter Grace flew to Newark, New Jersey for Whitney Houston's funeral at New Hope Baptist Church. They didn't have tickets to the service. They weren't invited. They simply stood outside with thousands of other mourners, people whose lives had been touched by Whitney's music. But Sarah had brought something with her. She had written a letter. The letter explained everything. The bridge, the radio, the baby, the medical school, the life that existed because Whitney's voice had reached through the darkness and pulled her back. Sarah didn't know if anyone would ever read her letter, but she needed to write it. She needed to try to thank the woman who had saved her life. As Sarah stood in the crowd outside the church, holding her letter in her daughter's hand, something remarkable happened. A member of Whitney's family, a cousin who was helping coordinate the service, noticed Sarah crying. Really crying, not the polite mourning of a fan, but the devastating grief of someone who had lost a personal savior. The cousin approached Sarah. "Did you know Whitney?" she asked gently. Sarah, through her tears, tried to explain. The words came out jumbled, emotional, but the essence was clear. Whitney had saved her life. The cousin listened to Sarah's story, looked at the letter in her hand, and made a decision. "Come with me," she said. Sarah and Grace were escorted into the church. They didn't sit with the family or the celebrities. They were placed in a section with other people whose lives Whitney had touched in profound ways. The woman who had been healed by Whitney's hospital visits during her cancer treatment. The man whose son Whitney had paid to send to college. The countless individuals who had been recipients of Whitney's private generosity. As the service began, Sarah clutched her letter. During a portion of the ceremony where family friends were invited to share memories, Sarah did something that surprised even herself. She stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her voice was uncertain, but she raised her hand. The officiant noticed her, and, in a moment of grace that seemed guided by something beyond human planning, invited her to approach the microphone. Sarah Mitchell walked to the front of New Hope Baptist Church with her letter in hand and her daughter by her side. She looked out at the assembled mourners, at Whitney's family in the front rows, at the cameras broadcasting this funeral around the world, and she began to speak. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm alive because of Whitney Houston." She told her story. Every detail. The bridge, the pregnancy, the despair, the radio, Whitney's spontaneous speech about being worthy of love exactly as you are. The choice to live. The daughter named Grace. The medical degree. the career dedicated to helping other young women. When Sarah finished speaking, you could hear her crying throughout the entire church. Whitney's mother, Whitney Houston, was openly weeping. Bobby Brown had his head in his hands. Kevin Costner, who had delivered a moving eulogy earlier, was wiping tears from his eyes. Sarah held up her daughter's hand. This is Grace Whitney Mitchell. She's 12 years old. She exists because your Whitney, your daughter, your friend, your co-star, spoke words on a November night in 1999 that saved both of our lives. Sarah's voice broke as she continued. I've spent 13 years wanting to thank her. I've spent 13 years wanting to tell her that she didn't just entertain me. She saved me. And now I'll never get that chance. But I want everyone here to know that Whitney Houston's legacy isn't just her music. It's the lives she saved, often without even knowing it. It's the hope she gave to people like me who thought hope was impossible. Sarah placed her letter on Whitney's casket. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for sharing your pain in a way that healed mine. Thank you for my daughter. Thank you for my life. As Sarah returned to her seat, the entire church gave her a standing ovation. But it wasn't really for Sarah. It was for Whitney, for the profound impact her life had on people she would never meet, for the ripple effects of one authentic moment on a Detroit stage. After the funeral, Sarah was approached by multiple media outlets wanting to tell her story. She agreed, not for attention, but because she wanted the world to understand what she understood. That artists like Whitney Houston carry immense pain, and sometimes that pain is what allows them to reach other people who are drowning. Sarah's story went viral. News outlets around the world covered the woman who had been saved by Whitney's voice. The recording of Whitney's November 1999 speech was tracked down and shared millions of times. People who had been struggling with their own darkness found hope in Sarah's testimony. The ripple effects continued. Wayne State University established the Whitney Houston Memorial Scholarship for single mothers pursuing medical degrees. Sarah became a spokesperson for suicide prevention, particularly focusing on pregnant teens. Grace, inspired by her mother's story and her namesake, went on to study music therapy, dedicating her career to using music as a healing tool. In 2015, Sarah opened her own practice in Detroit, specializing in high-risk pregnancies and adolescent obstetrics. Above her desk, she placed two things: a framed photo of Whitney Houston performing at the Fox Theater in 1999 and the radio that Marcus had held on the Ambassador Bridge that November night. Every patient who came to see Dr. Sarah Mitchell heard the story. Every frightened teenager, every woman facing an impossible situation, every person who felt like giving up was told about the night Whitney Houston unknowingly saved a life from 12 miles away. Marcus Chun, who had refused to leave Sarah alone on that bridge, remained her closest friend. He became a social worker specializing in crisis intervention. He often said that Whitney's spontaneous words had taught him the most important lesson of his career: that people on the edge of giving up don't need lectures or logic. They need to be reminded of their inherent worth. The Fox Theater in Detroit, where Whitney delivered that fateful performance, placed a small plaque in the venue. It reads, "On November 12, 1999, Whitney Houston performed here. Her words that night saved a life she would never know about." This is a reminder that authenticity has power, vulnerability has strength, and sometimes the most important performance is the one that comes straight from a broken heart. Sarah Mitchell never stopped listening to Whitney's music, but one song remained special. "I Believe in You and Me" was what she played in her delivery room when teenage mothers were giving birth. It was what she hummed when she was working with a patient who was losing hope. It was the soundtrack to the miracle of her own life. When Grace graduated from high school in 2018, she gave a speech at her commencement ceremony. She told her classmates about her origin story, about the bridge and the radio, and the superstar who saved her mother's life, which meant saving her life too. "We never know whose life we're touching," Grace said. "My mom's hero was a woman struggling with her own demons. But Whitney Houston's pain didn't make her less powerful. It made her more human. And in her humanity, she saved my mother. In saving my mother, she saved me. And through my mom's work, she's now saving hundreds of other lives." Grace looked out at the audience of proud parents and nervous graduates. We're all Whitney Houston on that stage. We're all capable of saving someone just by being honest about our struggles. We're all capable of giving someone a reason to live just by showing them they're not alone. The standing ovation that followed was for Grace, but also for Sarah, for Whitney, for everyone who has ever chosen to live when dying seemed easier. Today, Dr. Sarah Mitchell is one of Detroit's most respected OBGYNs. She has delivered over 2,000 babies, many of them to teenage mothers who came to her scared and alone, just like she once was. She tells every single one of them about November 12, 1999. She tells them about standing on a bridge in the cold. She tells them about a radio and a voice and a choice. And she tells them what Whitney Houston taught her. You are worthy of love right now. Not tomorrow. Not when you fix everything. Not when you have your life together. Right now. Exactly as you are, with all your mess and all your pain. You are worthy. Those words, spoken by a struggling superstar to a theater full of fans, transmitted through radio waves to a girl on a bridge, have now been passed on to thousands of young women who needed to hear them. This is Whitney Houston's legacy. Not just the awards or the record sales or the iconic performances, though those matter. Her legacy is the life that was saved, the doctor that life became, the thousands of other lives that doctor has now saved. Her legacy is Grace Whitney Mitchell, named for the grace of second chance, and a woman who made it possible. Her legacy is the reminder that our darkest moments, if we're brave enough to share them, can become someone else's light. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Whitney Houston teaches us something profound. It teaches us that authenticity matters more than perfection. It teaches us that vulnerability is not weakness, but connection. It teaches us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is tell someone, anyone, that they are worthy of love exactly as they are. Whitney Houston struggled. She fought demons that eventually took her life. But on one November night in Detroit, in a moment of raw honesty, she threw a lifeline to a drowning girl she would never meet. And that girl caught it. Sarah often wonders what would have happened if Marcus hadn't brought that radio. What would have happened if the concert hadn't been broadcast live? What would have happened if Whitney had stuck to the scripted performance instead of speaking from her broken heart? But those what-ifs don't matter, Sarah says. What matters is that it happened. What matters is that Whitney's pain connected with my pain, and in that connection, there was healing. What matters is that I'm here, Grace is here, and we're both doing everything we can to pass that healing forward. On February 11th, every year, the anniversary of Whitney's death, Sarah takes Grace to the Ambassador Bridge. They stand at the spot where Sarah almost ended her life, and they play I Believe in You and Me. They remember the woman who saved them. They honor the pain that became purpose. They celebrate the choice to live. And they recommit themselves to being voices of hope for others who are standing on their own metaphorical bridges, deciding whether the pain is too much to bear. If you or someone you know is struggling, if you're standing on your own bridge wondering if anyone would care if you were gone, please hear what Whitney Houston said that November night. You are worthy of love right now, exactly as you are, with all your mess, all your mistakes, all your pain. The world needs you in it. Your story isn't over. And somewhere out there, there's someone whose life will be changed because you chose to stay.